Well, I don't want to upset Donald Trump. Okay, you got me. I probably do. But the biblical text before us that Queen Sarah read for us is about an illegal immigrant who came from down south, crossed the border illegally into the northern kingdom, and went to the nation's capital to cause problems. Now, unlike Trump's scenario, Amos was not selling drugs, he was not committing crime, and to the best of my knowledge, he didn't rape anybody. He did, however, cross the border, went to the nation's capital, and went to the national cathedral. We always tend to think of the temple in Jerusalem as being the only religious place for Jews, but there were two nations at the time, and there was a temple in Bethel that was that nation's center of worship. And he went from the southern kingdom to the northern kingdom, to the cathedral, and started telling them that their government and their church was corrupt. They were corrupt because they were mistreating the poor, they were exploiting the vulnerable, and they were neglecting to take care of the elderly and the orphan. He said that the government was so corrupt that it was going to have to be replaced. And in this case, replaced by a foreign power. Now, people don't like to hear that kind of thing, especially not from a foreigner. So the people in Israel told Amos to get down off of his soapbox and go back to his own country and preach there. If you want to earn your living with hellfire and damnation sermons, go back and do it in your own country. And Amos defended himself by saying, I'm not a preacher, nor even a preacher's son. I'm just a farmer. I'm just the guy that takes care of the orchard and the vineyard. But Amos says that he's come to hold a plumb line in Israel, and I love that image. Amos is saying very clearly, I'm not a biblical expert, not a theologian, didn't go to seminary, don't have a PhD, I'm not a professor, I'm not a famous writer, I'm a farmer. I'm the guy that cleans up the branches in the orchard. But when you are telling the truth, it really doesn't matter who you are. One person armed with the truth trumps a majority. And so he's saying he's holding up a plumb line. Now, you know what a plumb line looks like. It hasn't changed much, actually, from the time of ancient Israel to the present, except that now I've got an app on my phone that does it, but that's different. But you can, you tie any heavy weight to a string and hold it up, and there's no way for it to ever be wrong. It doesn't matter if it's being held by a theologian. It doesn't matter if it's being held by a Republican or a Democrat. It doesn't matter if it's being held by a college professor. I'm pretty sure it wouldn't even matter if it was being held by a musician. It would still register the absolute truth. It can only be one thing. Amos can say that he's not a prophet, but he's doing what prophets do, which is telling the truth, largely to people who don't want to hear it. It's what I've always argued with my newspaper editors about, is that journalism happens when you publish something that someone doesn't want you to publish. Everything else is self-promotion. Anytime you stand up in public and say something that somebody doesn't want to hear, that there's no one who doesn't want to hear it, then all you're doing is promoting yourself. A prophet is someone who speaks truth to power, who holds a plumb line up, stands back and looks and says, you know what? Your government is corrupt, and your church is too, and so are a lot of your favorite institutions. They're crooked. Let me give you an example. 5 years ago now, big earthquake in Haiti, as if Haiti hadn't had enough problems. But devastating earthquake that left 500,000 people homeless in Haiti. And in an unprecedented bipartisan fundraising effort, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, the most unlikely pairing that you might come up with, worked together and they raised $500 million of relief money, all of which they donated to the Red Cross. And the Red Cross promised to use that money to provide housing for the Red Cross has been issuing reports in their literature about how successful their work was. So NPR, National Public Radio, in conjunction with a documentary filmmaker, went to Haiti to find out where the money was spent. And some of you, of course, have heard about this because many of you are as addicted to NPR reports as I am. They found that the Red Cross, in 5 years' time, with $500 million, had built 6 houses. Six. Their literature said over 100,000. 6. And the Red Cross complained then that they had been blindsided by the NPR report, that they hadn't been given any advance notice, and that in fact, that it had been very difficult to build houses in Haiti because the government oftentimes was corrupt and wouldn't help them to get land titles. They had difficulty finding clear title to land and reliable workers, but they had really tried. That in 5 years with $500 million, 6 houses was the best they could do. Now this is something with which I have personal experience. In 2004, the Rainbow Network director asked me to head up a project to build 200 houses in rural Nicaragua, where coffee plantation workers largely lived in mud huts in the jungle. And at that time, the Rainbow Network that Keith Jaspers had started had only built 70 houses in 10 years. So they didn't have a big housing project, and he wanted to really pump that up. So he asked me to raise the money to build 200 houses in a single year, which seemed ridiculous and impossible to accomplish. And I told him, I was more religious back then, I said, let me pray about this. And the next morning, I opened the News Leader, and on the front page was a column about how I had agreed to raise the money to build 200 houses in Nicaragua. So I called the office to complain, and I was told that's how the Lord works. And so my prayer was answered, and I was in charge of that project. There were problems. There had been the Sandinista War. There was government turnover. President Bolaños was not the most honest individual that I've ever met. We had difficulty getting clear title to land at times. There were coffee plantation owners who lied to us, who said they would give us land if we would build houses for their workers, and then they didn't want to give us titles. They wanted us to literally build houses on land they would still own. There were some of our new employees. We hired lots of new people, many of whom I really loved, but who also stole building materials from us. There were problems. And there were always corrupt politicians. And we make fun of this in third world countries. Don't think the United States of America doesn't work exactly the same way. It's just that our politicians steal on such a grand scale, it's harder to see. But in third world countries, when you want to help poor people, there's always some government agency demanding a bribe to let you go help their own people. But Keith Jaspers and I both made several trips to Nicaragua in 2004. We fired dishonest employees. We walked away from plantation owners. Thankfully, I saw Keith Jaspers just cussing a guy out in Spanish who was holding a machine gun while he was cussing him. But we weren't going to let them steal our resources or our land. And at the end of 8 months, we had built 200 houses that housed there were 7 or 8 people in each house. So we had thousands of people in a house of their own at the end of 8 months, and we did it with just about $500,000, which was tremendous in terms of cost effectiveness. What I'm saying is, I know it's hard to do these things, but I also know that it can be done if you actually mean to do it. And since that documentary has been released, there's been a lot of spin. The Red Cross has said, well, we did pass out tents. And 5 years later, many of those people are still living in those tents, and the tents are split. They didn't put any sewage or septic care in those tent villages. They're in worse shape than they were when the Red Cross showed up to build 6 houses, which wouldn't house more than 30 or 40 people at best. Now, you may not like what a plumb line says. You may be offended by the math of $500 million being spent on 6 houses. But the funny thing is that math doesn't care if you're offended. Math is math. And when you hold the plumb line up, the plumb line is true. The house that you're building, the fence that you're building, the cathedral that you're building, the government that you're building, if it doesn't line up with the plumb line, it's crooked. That's just the way it works. Now, most of you know our good friend Dr. Charlie Hedrick and I. Charlie Hedrick was a founding member of the Jesus Seminar, great biblical scholar, and he's been a guide for our church and a confidant for me, and I have lunch with him about once a month, and I strongly suspect that the faculty at MSU do not understand that the two of us are friends, because the conversation is oftentimes quite heated. We don't always agree with each other, and when it comes down to that point of not agreeing, Charlie always quotes this Amos text. He'll say, "You know, Roger, I am not a prophet, nor a prophet's son." And that is a way of sounding humble while saying, "I am right and you are wrong." And the mere fact that he is usually right is fairly immaterial to me. But I understand exactly what that process is of holding it up and saying, you know, you don't have to think that I'm well educated in this field. You don't have to think I'm a professional in this particular arena, but this is true. And there's no, you can yell, you can call the plumb line a socialist, you can call it a communist, you can call it whatever you want to call it, but it still is what it is. Now, we're very much looking forward to Bishop Spong visiting us here next week, and over the past couple of years, Bishop Spong and I have become good friends. I really, really love him, and he loves our church. He loves us. But I've told him that when I bought the first book of his that I bought, Why Christianity Must Change or Die, that I was not a big fan, that I would read a few pages and get so upset I'd stick the book back on the shelf. And then it just kept working on me. It was a yellow binder. I can still see it. And I would occasionally have to pull it off the shelf and read until I got mad again and put it. It took me 5 years to read that book, and it was maybe 170 pages long. And he wasn't saying anything that I hadn't heard in graduate school, quoting from Rudolf Bultmann or Paul Tillich or Reinhold Niebuhr. But Bishop Spong not only wanted us to take it serious in a graduate school kind of way, he wanted me to talk about it in church. And I was convinced if I did that, if I took the unvarnished results of biblical scholarship and preached it in a pulpit, I could get fired. And I was right. But even that doesn't matter. When we talk now about evidence-based faith, what I mean is being willing to hold on to the plumb line and to be very, very careful not to say anything in this pulpit that doesn't square with reality. No matter how difficult it may be to recognize that either the church or the American government or such popular charities as the not the Rainbow Network, but the Red Cross, might very well be crooked. I still believe in the Rainbow Network, by the way. I've worked for them and I've traveled with them, and I still think they're one of my favorite charities. ExxonMobil, one of the largest oil-producing companies in the world, will tell you in press conferences that they do not fund climate deniers. But they are the major funder of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is the primary distribution of misinformation about the climate. Just because they yell at the plumb line and say, we wouldn't do that, doesn't change the fact that they do it every day. I'm not saying that you shouldn't trust the Red Cross or ExxonMobil or to assume that they're always dishonest, just because I assume that they're always dishonest and I don't trust them. But I would like for you to explain to me why you wouldn't. I mean, if you're willing to look at the math, why would you trust them? Let me hold up a plumb line at a different area that's very important to our country right now. The Commonwealth Fund, a great research council, took a look at the funding of health care from the perspective of nations that have the best health care delivery among the top economic countries. They took the top 11 income receiving, earning countries in the world, which include Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and the United States, the 11 richest nations in the world, and tried to rank them by what it cost per person to have health care and how good the health care was. Now, we have a lot of politicians who tell us that the United States has the best health care system in the world. But what does our health care system cost? Ours is private, capitalist. It's a profit-driven health care system. The other 10 in that group of 11 all have national, single-payer, socialized, government-provided systems. But because ours is profit-driven, ours is the most expensive. In the United States, we spend an average of $8,500 per person. We have the most expensive health care delivery in the world. The next highest is Norway at $5,600 a person, which you can see is significantly less. We're at the top at $8,500, and even number 2 on the list is $5,600. Great Britain has a national health care service in which they spend $3,400 per person, significantly less than half of what we spend. So what do we get? How much better is our care than in Great Britain? We spend more than twice as much as Great Britain, and yet here's the hard math. The number 1 healthcare delivery country of that top 11 is Great Britain, and it's the one that spends the least amount of money. The United States ranks number 1 in spending, and we are number 11 in a group of the 11 richest countries of the world. I would add, if you look at the 36 richest countries in the world, we're number 34. Our healthcare system is among the worst in its delivery of healthcare in the world. Now, you can say that capitalism is better than socialism in some aspects of business, but folks, those of you that showered this morning, and I trust that should be all of you, you did not shower in capitalist water. You showered in socialist water. You made your breakfast not with capitalist electricity, but with socialist electricity. And while you slept last night, you were protected not by a private capitalist police force, fire department, weather service, National Guard, Air Force, or Navy, but by a socialist institution in each case. You are surrounded by socialism. Some of your breakfast food may have even been subsidized by government agencies, and others were not. There are things that seem to work more efficiently and more effectively when they are inspired by capitalism's promise of profit. But if you believe in math rather than in mythology, you have to acknowledge that medicine is not one of those things. That medicine does not work out better when it is run in a capitalist system. You don't have to like the math, but math doesn't care. You don't have to believe in science, because science doesn't care what you believe. You can argue with a plumb line, and while that will make you look very foolish, you will never change the direction in which the plumb line stands. As a religious person, as a pastor, I have a concern about social justice. It is the job of a prophetic church to speak the truth to power, especially when the society is increasing suffering among the masses in order to increase the wealth among the few. I'm not interested in political parties, or for that matter, in political systems. I'm interested in justice, and I am interested in the amelioration of suffering. Whichever political system, whichever political party, or whichever economic system makes that work. But Americans love talking about democracy, but ironically, they seem to hate it almost everywhere outside of government. What is a labor union but a socialist system of giving a voice to the people that makes it democratic? Most of us have a work site with an employer who is a dictator. Unions allow for democracy to happen in the workplace. What is a housing collective but a democracy in which you are giving voice to the people? We say we love democracy, but we seem to hate it at almost every turn in favor of a feudal dictatorship. What do we have against giving people a voice? Capitalism and democracy are not the same thing. In fact, capitalism is almost antithetical to democracy. Socialism is the economic system that puts ownership of the vital aspects of life in the hands of people, just like roads and water and electricity and a school system and a police force and an army. That is why the governments of Western Europe are called democratic socialist governments. And yet, even though in many ways we come very close to having a democratic socialist government in the United States, the words still scare us for completely irrational reasons. Americans have been taught in almost Pavlovian ways to respond negatively to the word socialism, but folks, the Pope that everybody seems to love now, Pope Francis, is a socialist. The Dalai Lama, everyone that rejects Christianity and runs to Buddhism loves the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama is a socialist. And when it comes to water, energy, transportation, food, education, and health care, so am I. Not because we're mixing religion and politics, but because we're trying to bring wisdom and compassion to society so that more people will lead a decent life and have the opportunity to have a meaningful life. Now, I've been a slow convert to really like Pope Francis. I was afraid a lot of his talk about poverty was window dressing, but I'm falling in love. I'm liking this guy better and better. I've been very wary of anyone at the top of the bureaucracy of any institutional religion, but it seems to me that Pope Francis is the real deal. He was recently quoted as saying, "We pray for the hungry, then we feed the hungry, because that's how prayer works." And that, to me, is evidence-based faith. Folks, the Pope is one of us. Evidence-based faith is rooted in reality. Praying and thinking God's going to do something is magical thinking. You pray for the hungry, then you feed the hungry, because that's how prayer works. We believe in action. We are spiritual, but we're not superstitious. We do not wait for divine deliverance. We try to become divine deliverance, because God has no hands but your hands. God has no feet but your feet. God has no voice but our voices, which means to me, we better be using our hands and our feet and speaking up. That's all I got to say.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.